On June 7, 1900, a single Boer commando of fewer than 500 men descended upon a British supply convoy, stretching for miles along the railway line near a station called Roodewal. Within hours, the raiders had destroyed or captured hundreds of supply wagons, killed or scattered the escort troops, and reduced months of carefully accumulated British supplies to smoking ruins. Food, ammunition, medical equipment, clothing, everything an army needed to sustain operations in the field went up in flames as outnumbered Boer commandos systematically looted and burned their way through one of the largest supply concentrations in South Africa. The raid at Roodewal exposed the fundamental vulnerability of Britain's entire military position. For all their victories on the battlefield and their capture of major cities, the British were dependent on a single railway line stretching hundreds of miles through hostile territory. That railway was their lifeline, and the Boers had just demonstrated they could sever it almost at will. The disaster at Roodewal would force a complete reassessment of British strategy and herald a new, more vicious phase of the war. This is the story of how a handful of raiders nearly brought the British war effort to its knees by attacking not armies, but the logistics that sustained them. To understand the significance of Roodewal, we must first grasp how completely the British military campaign in South Africa depended on railway logistics. By mid-1900, the conventional phase of the war appeared to be ending in British victory. Lord Roberts had captured Bloemfontein and Johannesburg, and Pretoria, the capital of the Transvaal, would fall within days of the Roodewal raid. British forces occupied every major city in the Boer republics. Newspapers in London were declaring the war effectively over, with only mopping up operations remaining. The reality on the ground told a very different story. The British Army in South Africa numbered well over 200,000 men by June 1900, a massive force spread across vast distances in a country with almost no paved roads and limited water sources. Supplying this army required moving thousands of tons of supplies daily, food for the soldiers, fodder for tens of thousands of horses and mules, ammunition, medical supplies, replacement equipment, fuel. Every biscuit, every bullet, every bandage had to be shipped from Britain to South African ports, then transported hundreds of miles inland to the armies in the field. The only practical means of moving such quantities across such distances was by railway. The British controlled the main Cape Railway line that ran north from the ports through the Orange Free State and into the Transvaal. This single rail line, much of it single track with only occasional passing loops, was the jugular vein of the entire British military effort. Break that railway, or even disrupt it significantly, and the armies in the field would begin to starve within days. Every British commander understood this vulnerability. But protecting hundreds of miles of railway through hostile territory proved nearly impossible. The Boer commandos, scattered and defeated in conventional battles, were discovering their true strength lay in exactly this kind of irregular warfare. Leaders like Christian de Wet had recognized that they could not match British numbers in pitched battles, but they could make the British occupation unbearable through raids on supply lines, ambushes of isolated columns, and attacks on the infrastructure that sustained British operations. The railway, stretching exposed and vulnerable across the veldt, was the perfect target. By early June, Lord Roberts was preparing for his final advance on Pretoria, confident that capturing the Transvaal capital would effectively end the war. His army was concentrated in the northern Orange Free State, supplied through the railway running back to Cape Town nearly 1,000 miles south. Roberts had established major supply depots at stations along this route, accumulating the stores necessary for the final push. One of these depots was at Roodewal Station, about 40 miles south of Kroonstad, where the railway crossed the Walsh River. Roodewal was never intended as a major base. just a convenient stopping point where trains could take on water and supplies could be transferred to wagons for distribution to nearby units. But as Robert's offensive developed, Roodewal had accumulated far more supplies than its defenses were designed to protect. Hundreds of wagons were parked near the station, loaded with everything from artillery ammunition to tinned beef to medical supplies. Additional stores were stacked in warehouses and under tarpaulins, awaiting transport forward. The total value of supplies at Roodewal represented weeks of logistical preparation, irreplaceable in the short term. The defense of this critical supply dump was astonishingly inadequate. The escort consisted of elements of the Derbyshire Regiment and some colonial mounted infantry, perhaps 500 men in total, many of them inexperienced or recovering from illness. They had no artillery and only limited ammunition. The defensive positions around Roodewal were minimal, just a few hastily dug trenches and some sandbag emplacements. The British High Command had grown complacent, assuming that Boer forces in the area were too scattered and demoralized to pose a serious threat. Christian de Wet thought differently. De Wet had established himself as the most capable Boer commander still in the field, a man with an almost supernatural ability to appear where he was least expected and disappear before British forces could respond. While Roberts was focused on his advance toward Pretoria, de Wet was ranging across the British rear areas with a mobile commando of highly skilled fighters, looking for opportunities to strike devastating blows against the vulnerable British supply system. De Wet's scouts had been monitoring British movements along the railway for weeks, noting the buildup of supplies at various stations and the generally poor state of their defences. Roodewal attracted de Wet's attention because of the sheer quantity of stores accumulated there and the apparent weakness of its garrison. In early June, de Wet made his decision. He would strike Roodewal with overwhelming speed, destroy as much as possible, and withdraw before British reinforcements could arrive. The commando that rode toward Roodewal numbered fewer than 500 men, but they were veterans, expert horsemen and marksmen who had survived months of hard campaigning. They were armed with modern rifles, mostly German Mausers, and they carried enough ammunition for a sustained engagement. More importantly, they were led by commanders who understood exactly what they needed to accomplish, and how little time they had to do it. The approach to Roodewal was conducted with the stealth and speed that characterized de Wet's operations. The Boers moved primarily at night, avoiding British patrols and keeping to terrain that concealed their movements. They travelled light with minimal baggage, able to cover vast distances in a day when necessary. British intelligence had detected increased Boer activity in the region, but reports were vague and contradictory. No one at Roodewal expected an imminent attack by a significant force. The raid began in the pre-dawn darkness of June 7, 1900. De Wet's commandos approached Roodewal from multiple directions, coordinating their movements to hit the British positions simultaneously. The first indication that something was wrong came when Boer riflemen opened fire on the British sentries from close range, dropping men before they could raise an alarm. Within minutes, the entire area around Roodewal station erupted into chaos. The British garrison, many of them sleeping when the attack began, struggled to organize a coherent defense. Officers trying to rally their men in the darkness were shot down by Boer marksmen who had infiltrated close to the British positions. The defenders who made it to their trenches found themselves under accurate rifle fire from multiple directions, unable to determine where the main Boer force was or how many attackers they faced. The confusion was compounded by the scattered nature of the British positions, with different units unable to support each other effectively. De Wet's tactical approach was methodical despite the speed of the attack. Rather than attempting to overrun the British defensive positions directly, which would have been costly, he used his riflemen to pin down the defenders, while other commandos moved among the supply wagons, looting and destroying. The Boers were expert at this kind of raid, having refined their techniques over months of guerrilla operations. They knew exactly what to take and what to burn, working with an efficiency that suggested careful planning. As dawn broke and visibility improved, the full extent of the disaster became apparent to the British defenders. Boer fighters were everywhere among the supply wagons, breaking open crates, loading valuables onto their own transport, and setting fire to everything they couldn't carry. Smoke began rising from dozens of points as wagons loaded with supplies went up in flames. The ammunition stores were a particular target. When the Boers set those alight, the resulting explosions sent shells and bullets flying in all directions, adding to the chaos and terror. The British troops attempted several counterattacks to drive the Boers away from the supply dumps, but these efforts were poorly coordinated and easily repulsed. The Boers had positioned sharpshooters who picked off British soldiers the moment they emerged from cover. Any organized movement drew concentrated fire from multiple directions. The British officers, many of them inexperienced in this kind of fighting, found their training and doctrine useless against an enemy who refused to mass for battle and instead fought as a swarm of individual marksmen. The psychological impact on the British defenders was severe. They could see their supplies being systematically destroyed, could hear the explosions as ammunition dumps went up, could watch helplessly as months of logistical preparation literally went up in smoke. There was a sense of utter helplessness, of being comprehensively outfought by a force that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Some British soldiers simply stopped fighting, convinced that resistance was futile and hoping that surrender might spare their lives. The Boers, for their part, worked with remarkable discipline given the temptations present. Hundreds of supply wagons contained not just military stores but luxuries that these men, many of whom had been living rough for months, found irresistible. There were cases of tinned food, barrels of rum, clothing, tobacco, medical supplies. De Wet's standing orders were clear: take ammunition first, then food and medical supplies, then anything else useful. Set fire to the rest and withdraw before British reinforcements arrive. The commandos mostly followed these orders, though the chaos of the raid inevitably led to some disorganization as men stopped to loot particularly attractive targets. By mid-morning, British reinforcements were beginning to arrive from nearby positions, alerted by the smoke and sound of explosions. But De Wet had anticipated this and had positioned rear guards to delay any relief force. The British troops attempting to reach Roodewal found themselves under fire from concealed positions, forced to deploy and advance cautiously while the destruction of the supply dump continued. The Boer rear guards were not trying to win firefights, but simply to buy time, and they succeeded perfectly. By early afternoon, De Wet judged that his commandos had accomplished everything possible and that the risk of being trapped by converging British forces was growing too great. He gave the order to withdraw, and the Boer fighters disengaged with the same speed and coordination they had shown in the attack. Within an hour, they had vanished into the veldt, their wagons loaded with captured supplies, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The British relief forces that finally reached Roodewal in late afternoon found a disaster of staggering proportions. Hundreds of supply wagons were destroyed, many still burning. The ammunition dumps had been completely destroyed, with unexploded shells and cartridges scattered across a wide area, making the site dangerous to approach. Food supplies worth thousands of pounds had been burned or contaminated. Medical supplies that the army desperately needed were gone. The railway station itself was damaged, and several locomotives had been rendered inoperable. The human cost was also significant, though not catastrophic by the standards of conventional battles. The British garrison had suffered over 100 casualties, including several officers killed. Many wounded men had been left behind by their comrades in the confusion of the fighting and the rapid arrival of the Boers. The Boer casualties were remarkably light, perhaps 20 men killed or wounded, a testament to their tactical skill and the vulnerability of the target they had struck. But the true impact of Roodewal was measured in logistics rather than casualties. British staff officers attempting to assess the damage quickly realized that the loss of supplies would force a complete revision of operational plans. The food supplies destroyed at Roodewal represented weeks of rations for thousands of troops. The ammunition would need to be replaced from depots hundreds of miles away, a process that would take weeks. Medical supplies were in critically short supply across the entire army, and the loss of the Roodewal stocks would mean soldiers dying from treatable wounds and diseases. Lord Roberts received the news of the Roodewal disaster while preparing for his triumphant entry into Pretoria. The contrast between the political symbolism of capturing the enemy capital and the practical reality of having his supply line devastated by a small raiding party could not have been more stark. Roberts immediately understood that Roodewal changed everything. His army could not sustain operations deep in the Transvaal if the supply line from the Cape was vulnerable to this kind of raid. Every supply convoy, every railway station, every depot was now a potential target for Boer commandos operating in his rear. The British response to Roodewal involved a massive reallocation of forces to railway protection. Thousands of troops who might otherwise have been used in offensive operations were instead deployed to guard stations, escort convoys, and patrol the railway line. Blockhouses, small, fortified positions, manned by a dozen or so soldiers, began to appear at regular intervals along the railway. These measures consumed enormous resources and manpower, but were absolutely necessary given the demonstrated vulnerability of the supply system. The propaganda impact of Roodewal was significant for both sides. For the Boers, it was proof that the war was far from over and that they retained the ability to strike damaging blows against the British, despite having lost all their major cities. De Wet's successful raid became legendary among the commandos, demonstrating that intelligent guerrilla warfare could achieve more than conventional battles against overwhelming British numbers. The story of the raid spread through the Boer forces, bolstering morale at a time when many fighters were considering surrender. For the British public, Roodewal was a shock that undermined the narrative of imminent victory. Newspapers that had been declaring the war effectively over suddenly had to explain how a small Boer force had destroyed a major supply depot deep in supposedly secured territory. Questions were raised in Parliament about the competence of the military administration and the adequacy of measures to protect the army's logistics. The comfortable assumption that occupying enemy capitals meant winning the war was shattered. Christian de Wet's reputation was enormously enhanced by Roodewal and similar raids. He became the most wanted man in South Africa from the British perspective, with entire columns dedicated to hunting him down. Yet he seemed to possess an almost magical ability to evade capture, appearing suddenly to strike devastating blows and then vanishing before British forces could respond. His understanding of guerrilla warfare, of how a mobile force could exploit the vulnerabilities of a conventional army, was far ahead of most military thinking of the era. The strategic implications of Roodewal extended beyond the immediate loss of supplies. The raid demonstrated that British control of territory was largely illusory. They could occupy cities and move large armies across the country, but they could not prevent small, mobile Boer commandos from operating almost anywhere. The British were learning the bitter lesson that winning conventional battles and occupying territory did not necessarily win a guerrilla war. Control meant nothing if you couldn't protect your supply lines and administrative infrastructure. The Boer strategy evolved significantly after Roodewal, with increasing emphasis on exactly this kind of raid. Rather than attempting to hold ground or fight conventional battles, the commandos focused on attacking British logistics, communications, and isolated garrisons. This approach could not win the war in the sense of defeating British armies or forcing a negotiated peace, but it could make the British victory so expensive and frustrating that political will to continue the war might collapse. The British, in response, adopted increasingly harsh measures against the civilian population. Since Boer commandos operated among the civilian population, drawing supplies and support from farms across the republics, British commanders decided to eliminate that support base. The infamous scorched earth policy began in earnest after raids like Roodewal, with British columns systematically burning farms, destroying crops, and moving Boer civilians into concentration camps. The logic was brutal but clear. If the commandos had no base of support, they could not sustain operations. These concentration camps would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire war. Designed simply to remove civilians from the conflict zone and prevent them from supporting the commandos, the camps quickly became scenes of humanitarian disaster. Overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and insufficient food led to disease epidemics that killed thousands of Boer women and children. The camps inflicted more casualties on the Boer population than all the battles of the war combined, and the memory of them would poison Anglo-Boer relations for generations. The railway war that Roodewal exemplified continued for the remainder of the conflict. The British built thousands of blockhouses and strung barbed wire for hundreds of miles, attempting to protect the railway. They organized fast-moving columns to hunt Boer commandos. They developed better intelligence networks to predict raids. But despite all these measures, the Boers continued to strike at British logistics with varying degrees of success until the war's end in 1902. The tactical lessons of Roodewal were studied by military professionals worldwide, though many of the implications were not fully understood until later conflicts. The raid demonstrated the vulnerability of modern armies to attacks on their logistics, a lesson that would be relearned in both world wars and subsequent conflicts. It showed that technological superiority and numerical advantage could be negated by mobile, intelligent, irregular forces willing to avoid conventional battle and focus on strategic vulnerabilities. On a more immediate level, Roodewal illustrated the importance of proper security for supply lines and the dangers of complacency. The British garrison at Roodewal had been inadequate, not because of resource constraints, but because of a failure to appreciate the threat. The High Command had assumed that defeated Boer forces posed no significant danger to rear areas, an assumption that proved catastrophically wrong. This kind of institutional complacency would recur throughout military history with similar results. The impact on British logistics planning was profound and lasting. The Army Service Corps, responsible for military logistics, underwent significant reforms, partly as a result of experiences like Roodewal. The importance of supply line security was emphasized in training and doctrine. The concept of operational reach, the maximum distance an army could operate from its supply base, became a central consideration in strategic planning. These were lessons learned at the cost of burned wagons and destroyed supplies on the South African veldt. For the individual soldiers involved, both British and Boer, Roodewal represented very different experiences. The British defenders endured a nightmare of confusion and defeat, watching helplessly as everything they were supposed to protect was destroyed. Many of them were captured, spending the remainder of the war in Boer prisoner camps. Those who escaped carried memories of utter tactical helplessness against an enemy who seemed to know exactly what they were doing, while British command structures collapsed into chaos. The Boer commandos, conversely, experienced Roodewal as a validation of their approach to warfare. They had struck a devastating blow against enormous numerical odds. destroying supplies worth far more than their small force could ever have captured in conventional battle. They had demonstrated that intelligence, mobility, and surprise could overcome vast material superiority. The supplies they captured, particularly ammunition and medical stores, sustained their operations for weeks afterward. When we reflect on the raid at Roodewal more than a century later, its significance extends beyond the immediate military impact. It represented a fundamental challenge to conventional military thinking about how wars were won. The British had followed the traditional playbook: defeat enemy armies in battle, capture important cities and territory, occupy the country. Roodewal demonstrated that in modern warfare, logistics could be as important as combat power. An army that could not protect its supply lines was vulnerable regardless of how many battles it won. This was a lesson that would need to be relearned repeatedly throughout the 20th century, from the German submarines attacking Allied supply convoys in both world wars to the insurgent attacks on coalition supply lines in Iraq and Afghanistan. The fundamental dynamic remained constant. Conventional military superiority meant little if irregular forces could attack the logistics that sustained that superiority. The disaster at Roodewal also highlighted the psychological dimensions of guerrilla warfare. The British had occupied the Boer capitals and could claim victory in conventional terms. But raids like Roodewal undermined that narrative and demonstrated continued Boer resistance. The political impact of such raids, the way they challenged the official story of victory and forced continued commitment of resources, was as important as their immediate military effect. Modern counterinsurgency theorists would recognize this as a classic example of how irregular forces can achieve strategic effects through tactical actions that conventional military metrics might dismiss as insignificant. The railway line that De Wet's commandos attacked at Roodewal was more than just a logistics route. It was a symbol of British power and technological superiority. Railways represented modernity, industrial might, the ability to project power across vast distances. The fact that this symbol of modern military capability could be successfully attacked by what British propaganda portrayed as backward farmers, fighting with obsolete methods, was deeply unsettling. It suggested that technological superiority alone could not guarantee victory. That warfare was fundamentally about human factors, intelligence, and adaptability. The memory of Roodewal lingered long after the Boer War ended. British military planners in subsequent conflicts obsessed over supply line security, sometimes to the point of operational paralysis. The fear of another Roodewal, of having months of logistical preparation destroyed in a single raid, influenced everything from convoy procedures to base security to operational planning. In some ways, this represented learning from history. In others, it demonstrated how a single traumatic event could warp strategic thinking. For South Africans, both Boer and British descendants, Roodewal became part of the complex mythology of the war. It represented Boer courage and tactical brilliance, but also the beginning of the brutal phase of farm burning and concentration camps that would follow. The raid was simultaneously a point of pride and a harbinger of the suffering to come. This duality, the way tactical success led to strategic escalation and increased suffering for civilians, encapsulated the tragedy of the entire conflict. The Boer raid that destroyed Britney's supply line at Roodewal stands as a testament to the enduring power of asymmetric warfare, the vulnerability of conventional forces to intelligent, irregular opposition, and the critical importance of logistics in modern military operations. 500 Boer commandos had achieved more in a single day's raid than could have been accomplished through months of conventional operations. They had forced a complete reassessment of British strategy, consumed resources out of all proportion to their numbers, and demonstrated that the war was far from over despite the fall of Pretoria. The burning wagons at Roodewal, the destroyed supplies, the scattered British defenders, all of these were symptoms of a larger truth that conventional military establishments have always struggled to accept. That wars are not won simply by occupying territory or defeating armies in the field, but by breaking the enemy's will and capacity to resist. The Boers understood this instinctively, adapting their strategy to focus on targets that would hurt Britain strategically even when they could no longer win conventional battles. The disaster at Roodewal was the price Britain paid for underestimating an enemy who refused to fight according to European rules, and the lessons written in smoke and fire that day would echo through a century of subsequent conflicts.